The cheapest entry ticket to the world of 4K 60p and 10-bit recording for professional videographers and amateurs as well. Sony ZV-e10 Mark II, which is filming me right now. Let's have a closer look. What's good guys, my name is Oleg Nikitin and you're watching No Limits On channel. So basically Sony ZV-e10 Mark II has exactly the same sensor as the Sony a6700 and Sony FX30. It does lack some features from both cameras, but let me tell you that the image quality is exactly the same, both in stills and in video mode of course. So if you want to learn more about the image quality, the noise performance, the comparison of the image between different cameras, I'll leave the links to 3 of my videos. The first one is being Sony FX30 versus Sony a7 IV, the second one is the FX30 versus Sony ZV-e10, and the third one is a7 III, a7S III versus a7 IV, so you'll be able to compare all 3 main sensors that Sony produce nowadays from a7 IV, from FX30 and from a7S III in different camera bodies, but you'll see all the details about the image quality in those videos. I'll not cover this in this video. First, let's talk about autofocus performance. It is slightly better than on the Sony FX30. It has the eye recognition, the face recognition, animals, birds as well, but it's not as advanced as the Sony a6700 or the Sony ZV-e10 because those 2 cameras, they do have built-in artificial intelligence, let me say, and they do recognize people from the back, they have further distances, they can recognize trains, planes, etc. It's not as advanced on the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II, but it does have better autofocus because when you go to clear image zoom mode, so you zoom in digitally, it still retains the eye and the face recognition and autofocus, whereas the Sony FX30 does not, and it loses the eye and face tracking capabilities. And of course, guys, I did purchase this camera with a new kit lens, which is 16 to 50mm f3.5 to 5.6 OSS Mark II, and it has a plastic lens mount, by the way, but still this lens is very cheap if you buy it as a kit lens, around $100, and I do think that for $100 it's pretty decent. It's quite sharp in the middle, the corners are not that sharp, but it's okay, and I think as a backup lens, it's a nice touch. Or if you want to travel with your camera, it weighs almost nothing, so I do suggest buying a kit lens, even if you wouldn't use it a ton. And since I said about the image stabilization in the lens, OIS, in the kit lens, let me tell you about the stabilization in this camera in general. So basically this camera does not have any IBIS, so the sensor is not stabilized, and we have 3 different levels of stabilization. First one is being off completely, the second one is standard, but it's only for the lenses that come with built-in image stabilization in the lens, like the kit lens, and the third one is active, and it adds a lot of a crop, 1.4 times approximately, but it does stabilize your footage in a pretty good way if you use shorter shutter speeds, and I'll show you the images with longer shutter speeds, like the proper one, 1/50th of a second, and also on the shorter shutter speeds as well. So right here you can see the comparison of the field of view without stabilization and with active stabilization. This means it applied a crop of 1.4x and you lose quite a bit of width of your shot. And here's the comparison of all 3 modes: off, stabilization of the lens, and the active stabilization with an additional crop. And as you can tell, the OIS does have a difference between not having any stabilization and having something, but it doesn't do well in the roll axis, so you can see that the image slightly tilts all the time. The active does add a lot of stability, but still it's not like the best performance. You still see some wobble, and on longer shutter speeds you have some artifacts. I'll show you those in a minute, and we'll also listen to the built-in microphone on the vlogging tests. And right now, guys, I'm using the kit lens, the 16 to 50 with built-in stabilization, with stabilization set to standard, which is only the built-in OIS, optical image stabilization in the lens, and also you can hear the built-in microphone, which is directed forward. So I manually set it up to be picking the sound from the front. So how do you like the sound and the stabilization? We're also using the f3.5 right now, and this is the background blur that you get with this combo. And right now, guys, I'm using the active stabilization mode. It adds a digital crop about 1.4 times, multiplying the crop factor of the camera itself, but you get a smoother image. We're right now using the 1/400th of a second. That is why we will not get any artifacts of the stabilization, and I think that all in all the image should be much more stable, of course, but also, guys, it's much tighter as well. And I think you all know, guys, that Sony cameras do have better image stabilization with native Sony lenses, but if you use a third-party lens like Viltrox 13mm f1.4 in this example, you can have worse performance of the IBIS or of the stabilization itself. Here is the comparison of stabilization off versus 1.4x crop active stabilization. It does add the stability, it looks okay on a small screen, but on the bigger screen I can see the artifacts from the longer shutter speed. We're using 1/50th of a second shutter speed, and as you can tell, guys, it is slightly usable but not really usable, so I wouldn't lean hard on the image stabilization of this camera. And right now, guys, I'm using the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 lens with active stabilization. It's only a digital stabilization with a third-party lens, and we all know that third-party lenses don't have as good of a stabilization with Sony bodies, but the Sony lenses, even though they don't have, some of them, the built-in OIS, they do have better performance with stabilization. So right now I'm using an ND filter at f1.4. We have 1/50th of a shutter, so the correct shutter speed for 4K 25 frames per second. And I want to see if we have a lot of wobble from the electronic stabilization and also the artifacts of stabilization, because we're using the 1/50th shutter speed, a pretty slow shutter speed. So let me go faster, like so, move around. So probably we could see some issues. And right now, guys, you are watching the image without any image stabilization. The lens is not stabilized, the camera is not stabilized, so the steady shot's off, but it's not having a steady shot, to be honest. So this is the image quality you get without any stabilization, but we do get a wider shot, as you can tell. And to conclude about the stabilization of this camera, guys, it is usable in some instances, but I would highly recommend using something like a monopod, a tripod, or a slider, or a gimbal with this camera if you want to add motion to your shots. And now, guys, one of the most important parts for professional videographers, overheating. So I've tested this camera on the first version of the firmware. I didn't update it at all. I've set the temperature threshold too high, and I've recorded indoors at 24 degrees Celsius in 4K 25 frames per second for 2 hours and 30 minutes without the overheating sign or overheating itself. Then I let the camera cool down, and then I tried recording in 4K 50 frames per second because we live in PAL region, and it was working for about 1 hour. Then it showed me the sign of overheating, and in about 5 minutes it's overheated, but it's a good performance in my opinion. Then I also let it cool down and tried using it with a cooling fan from Ulanzi. It's a pretty, regular, usual fan, let me say, not a fancy fan with Peltier element that cools down like crazy. No, just a simple fan, and it worked indefinitely almost in 4K 50 for 1 hour and 40 minutes without the sign of overheating. So with a cooling fan, you can definitely use it in 4K 50 or 60 frames per second. If you want to use it with charging the camera, or you want to use it outdoors in plus 30 degrees Celsius or something like this, just purchase an external cooler. That's my recommendation, guys. Other than that, in 4K 25, it was doing flawlessly. And the battery life, of course, is great. In 4K 25 frames per second, I was getting 2.5 hours of work time, and in 50 frames per second, I was getting about 1 hour and 40 minutes, which is great for this small of a camera. The Sony ZV-e10 Mark II also comes with a couple of new features. First of all is the vertical mode, so you can see all the UI elements of the menu in vertical orientation, and you can use touchscreen, which is great. I also use touchscreen with my Sony ZV-e1, and I love this feature because you can simply tap on the settings and change those. It also comes with a new menu. You can work with LUTs, you can use the focus map feature, focus breathing compensation, so all the fancy features of new Sony cameras are in this one. But what if we compare it to the Sony ZV-e10 Mark I? Is it much better? For video, it is a lot better. First of all, we had a pretty old sensor in the ZV-e10. It had horrible rolling shutter effect. This one is much better for the rolling shutter performance. Also, it comes with 10-bit. And also it comes with 4K 60, whereas the first generation was only 4K 30. It had pretty poor colors as well, in my opinion, so this camera is highly recommended for video compared to the first generation. But compared to the previous generation, it doesn't have a physical shutter. So the ZV-e10 Mark I had a physical shutter, and it was more suited towards photographers, whereas the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II does not have it, and photographers can come into issues with special lighting and with very highly dynamic scenes like sports. You can have some rolling shutter effects, so keep that in mind. Also, guys, this camera does have a cheaper fill-in, cheaper materials compared to the Sony ZV-e1. because it's a flagship, I guess, of the ZV lineup. But all in all, the feeling about the materials, the plastic, the clickiness of the buttons, all in all, the camera feels much cheaper than the Sony ZV-e10. To me, it's not a huge issue. The only thing that irritates me is the floppy doors, because you have your microphone in, headphones in, also the USB Type-C and the micro HDMI behind those doors, and they're pretty flimsy and rubbery. Don't really like those, but other than that, it's more than okay. And this camera does have a 1 million dot LCD, 3-inch. It's okay, it's plenty bright in sunny weather mode, nothing too crazy, the same as on the Sony ZV-e10. I'm okay with this display because I usually use my 5-inch monitors with the cameras, so I'm pretty fine. If I need to use those, I can use those. It's nothing like super crazy and great, but it's doable. The fancy microphone in which you can change the direction of the microphone is there. It's okay, it sounded not that bad to be honest, and you've heard it already, but to be honest guys, I'm not a fan of like built-in microphones. I would rather use a lavalier microphone all day, all night. And also guys, the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II does feature and does retain the intelligent hot shoe, so you can plug in wirelessly almost the shotgun microphones or the lavalier microphones straight to that hot shoe, and it'll gain the digital signal straight to the camera, which is a nice touch. What are the best lenses for the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II? Right now I'm filming with the Viltrox 27mm f1.2 lens, my favorite APS-C lens of all time. You can see the background separation, the sharpness is simply great. I also do like the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 that I showed you on my vlogging test. It's a great lens, it's super fast, really sharp, great lens for the gimbal shots, no doubt. Also, I really like the Tamron 17 to 70mm f2.8 VC, but only for the Sony cameras that don't have IBIS, because I've been using it with my Sony FX30 and it had some issues with the IBIS. It wasn't stabilizing this camera properly, but for the cameras that don't have IBIS, like the ZV-e10 Mark I or Mark II, it's a great versatile lens. And the third option, kind of a trinity of Viltrox lenses, the 75mm f1.2 lens for gorgeous portrait shots. So how did I use this camera? My first shoot was on the podcast and I used it as a C camera with the 85mm f1.8 lens from Yongnuo, and it did great, wide open. Autofocus was spot on, just a great C camera in my opinion. I also did use it as my top-down camera and it also did great, and I also used it with the new Sirui lens 40mm f1.8 anamorphic lens, and as you can tell we have pretty cool shots with this camera. It was on the gimbal as well, so I do know what to expect from this sensor because it's the same as in the FX30, and in my opinion it's one of the best sensors for APS-C format that is on the market right now. And here comes one of the main questions. Should you purchase this camera as the first one or the only camera to film videos? If you are a beginner, I would say yes, if you understand the limitations of this camera. What do I mean? First of all, the stabilization. You have to use tripods or monopods or gimbals. If you know how to work with those, great. Second, the overheating issue. If you don't film like 1.5 hours, 2 hours in 4K 60, you'll be fine. If you do, just purchase a cooler or something else, maybe not this camera, and purchase the FX30 instead. But all in all guys, I would totally be fine for my vlogging and my blog with this camera only, because it does have really great image quality. I know all the limitations of this camera and I don't really care. I know how to work with those. But guys, if you are into photography and you consider purchasing your first and only camera, I would highly recommend taking a look at the Sony a6700, adding $400 to the cost, but you'll get the physical shutter, you'll get the EVF, and you'll get better autofocus performance, and for photos the a6700 is much more preferable. But if you are into video and you do make long-form content, you are afraid of overheating and you need to have redundant backup with your camera, the FX30 for $800 more is a very reliable option with weather sealing. It's all in all a more versatile camera for filmmakers, but I do think that for the money, for $1,100 with the kit lens, the ZV-e10 Mark II is just a killer deal. But if you consider this camera as a B camera or a C camera for your A7 IV, A7S III, ZV-e10, whatever, the ZV-e10 Mark II is just a bargain, and I would highly recommend it. Just purchase a cooling fan just in case and you'll be ready to go. The image quality is there and all in all the features are great. Highly recommend it. So guys, what do you think of the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II as your first and main camera, or as a second B or C camera, or as a camera that you use instead of your iPhone for reels making? Please let me know in the comment section below. If you did enjoy this video, please smash the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notifications bell. And right here guys, I'll leave my in-depth comparison video of the Sony FX30, which has exactly the same sensor as the ZV-e10 Mark II, with the Sony ZV-e1, which has exactly the same sensor as the Sony FX3. I'll see you in that video, guys. Take care. Bye.